So, among other things, I'd like to talk about the thought system of A Course in Miracles and what it's like to apply it, and also, how it relates to other things, how it translates into other things that we're used to thinking of in the spiritual community, in the spiritual world. I'd like to start off by going over a very important idea in the Course, and that shows up in Workbook Lesson number 70, among other places. And it's the idea that my salvation comes from me. So salvation is not something that is given to us by another person. Like, some people think that you can be enlightened by being in the presence of other spiritual masters, just by being with them, and it rubs off on you or something. But the truth is, the ego has to be undone, and so you kind of have to, forgive everything that comes up for you. It's not really something that can be done, by somebody else for you. There's no such thing as vicarious salvation, which is also something that shows up in that idea of Jesus suffering and sacrificing himself for us, and somehow that gives us salvation. Salvation is not something that comes from outside of you. It's something that comes from within. And that's why we have this workbook lesson that says salvation comes from me. And that lesson says, the seeming cost of accepting today's idea is this. It means that nothing outside yourself can save you. Nothing outside yourself can give you peace. But it also means that nothing outside yourself can hurt you, or disturb your peace, or upset you in any way. Today's idea places you in charge of the universe, where you belong, because of what you are. This is not a role that can be partially accepted, and you must surely begin to see that accepting it is salvation. So, along those lines, let's go over a few basic ideas. First of all, we should remember that we should not confuse consciousness with spirit. They are two different things. A Course in Miracles identifies consciousness as the domain of the ego because it takes place in a place that seems to be outside of perfect oneness, and so you have perception going on. You have a subject and an object. That's consciousness, that's the domain of the ego. Consciousness is all ego. But, as A Course in Miracles says, the ego can learn. So, in a way, what we're doing is we're actually educating the ego to choose against itself. It's almost like you're educating the ego to choose spirit and wholeness and oneness instead of the idea of separation. Some people may say that, you should make the ego your friend and that you should just get along with it. Well, that's fine, but it won't undo the ego. As Course in Miracles says, salvation is undoing. And if you undo the ego, there may be times when the ego isn't too happy about that. So you can't depend on the ego always being your friend. In fact, the Course in Miracles says that by questioning the ego's beliefs, that you are going too far as the ego is concerned, and it will not be your friend. So that idea of making the ego your friend, wherever it came from, it certainly doesn't have anything to do with the Course in Miracles. What A Course in Miracles wants to do is undo the ego in no uncertain terms. Another thing about forgiveness is that observing your thoughts is not forgiving them. I've heard people say that, if you have judgmental thoughts and you see them, then you just don't react to them and you don't judge them and you just let them go by. And that is a powerful teaching in the sense that it does indeed bring your focus back to the mind instead of out there in the effect. But it's still not forgiveness. It's not really the same as A Course in Miracles. It's a step in the right direction because, now you're calming down a little bit and you're observing instead of reacting, and that's cool. But remember that to forgive is to actually notice that which seemed to be outside of you and recognizing that it does not exist, and that the only thing that does really exist is your perfect oneness with God, and that everything else is an illusion and can be forgiven because it hasn't really happened. So those thoughts are not you. Those thoughts are simply something that should be forgiven. Just like your consciousness is not you, and it's something that simply needs to be forgiven and let go of completely and replaced by the idea of what you really are, which is spirit. And the best way to see yourself as spirit is to see others as spirit. The reason that it's so important to forgive what appears to be outside of us is because that is how we get into the unconscious mind. Remember, the unconscious mind is something that is hidden from us. It's out of our awareness, and we'd never be able to see it, except Jesus has explained to us in the Course how it shows up to us as a symbolic representation outside of ourselves. It's not really outside of ourselves, but it looks like it's out of ourselves. And so, the only way to undo all this crap that's in the unconscious mind is by forgiving what appears to be outside of you. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with them, but that's why other methods are not A Course in Miracles, because A Course in Miracles gives you a way of actually changing and releasing that which is locked in the deep canyons of your unconscious mind, and other methods don't do that. Methods like observing your thoughts, being in the now, things of that nature, they're fine, and they're very closely related to ideas like be here now. However, what the forgiveness of A Course in Miracles does is that by forgiving that which appears to be outside of ourselves, we're actually undoing that which corresponds to it in the unconscious mind. And that's a different approach than what you see anyplace else. And if we don't forgive that which appears to be outside of ourselves, then we will not release the unconscious guilt that is in the mind. And as long as there is any unconscious guilt in the mind, then we will perpetuate this cycle of birth and death. We will not end reincarnation. We will not put an end to the whole ego thought system until that unconscious guilt has been removed from the mind. As long as it's there, we will keep appearing to reincarnate. A Course in Miracles is always applied at the level of the mind, and never on the level of the world, never on the level of form. A lot of people have level confusion when it comes to the Course. But if you just remember that one simple fact, that A Course in Miracles is always done at the level of the mind, then you can avoid that confusion. Which is why, we've said before, but it's a very important point. The Course says, seek not to change the world, seek rather to change your mind about the world. So when you read the Course, you should remember that what you're reading and the teachings that you're seeing are always to be applied from the level of the mind and never out there in the world. For example, there's a quote in the Course that tells you that if your brother asks you to do something, no matter how outrageous it is, you should do it. Well, that doesn't mean that if your brother is drunk and asks you for the car keys, that you give him the car keys and have him go out and kill a bunch of people. That's silly. The way that that's to be applied is that no matter how outrageous he is doing something that requires forgiveness, then that's what you're being asked to do. You're being asked to forgive whatever happens out there. So it's always done at the level of the mind, and if you don't remember that, then some very strange things can happen, and some very strange interpretations of A Course in Miracles can show up. There is only one possible explanation of A Course in Miracles. If you go by the definitive statements that are made in the Course, then there can't possibly be any other interpretation. For example, there's a section in A Course in Miracles called The Laws of Chaos. And I'm going to just read a brief quote from that, the way that my teachers put it in The Disappearance of the Universe, because I think it's really important. In fact, they had me read that brief quote from the first law of chaos, and then Persa said something about it afterwards that I thought was very important, so I'm also going to read to you what she said about it. Here are the laws that ruled the world you made, and yet they govern nothing, and need not be broken, merely looked upon and gone beyond. The first chaotic law is that the truth is different for everyone. Like all these principles, this one maintains that each is separate and has a different set of thoughts that set him off from others. This principle evolves from the belief there is a hierarchy of illusions. Some are more valuable and therefore true. And then this is what Persa said about that. She said, everybody is trying to find and express their truth. Their so-called truth is actually designed to keep them stuck where they are. What Jay is teaching in his course is that the truth is not different for everyone. It is not relative. He's saying the truth is the truth whether you understand and agree with it or not. The truth is not subject to your interpretation, and neither is his course. He's the teacher and you're the student. If that's not the case, then why do the course? Do anything you want. Let your mind run wild. Get drunk. So it's very important to remember that the Course is teaching that the truth is spirit, which is pure and immortal and invulnerable and totally undivided and perfectly one and whole, and that nothing else is true. And if you remember that, then you can't go wrong. It's a very simple interpretation, and it's a purely non-dualistic interpretation of A Course in Miracles. If you're coming from there, then everything in the Course will make sense, and you'll start to see how it shows up everywhere. But if you confuse levels and start to make it about the level of effect instead of the level of cause, if you start to make it dualistic and divided instead of non-dualistic and whole and one and complete, then that leads to confusion. Another thing that can lead to confusion in A Course in Miracles is when people try to give the Course a literal translation when they shouldn't be giving it a literal translation. There are parts of the Course that should be taken literally, but those are the parts of the Course that express the absolute truth that we just mentioned in that previous quotation, because the truth is whole and one and perfect. So when the Course makes metaphysical statements, for example, it says, I am not a body, I am free, for I am still as God created me. Well, that is a true statement and should be taken literally. When it says that God is real, and that God is the only reality, and that Spirit is the only reality, and things like that, then that should be taken literally. But sometimes the Course will seem to express dualism. It will seem to express things that would suggest other than what the Course is really teaching. I'll give you an example. At one point, the Course says, God knows not of separation. Well, that is a true statement, and that should be taken literally, because it expresses the absolute truth, that God doesn't have anything to do with this world, and God knows not of separation. That should be taken literally. Elsewhere in the Course, it says, God weeps for his children. Well, it would seem that those two statements are contradictory unless you understand that anything that expresses duality, anything that expresses separation in A Course in Miracles must be taken as metaphor. Why? Because the Holy Spirit meets people where they think they are. And if you read A Course in Miracles with that in mind, if you understand that anything that expresses the metaphysical truth should be taken literally, and anything that expresses duality or separation should be taken as metaphor, then the Course does not contradict itself at all. I know people who have given up on A Course in Miracles and stopped doing it because they incorrectly believed that it was contradicting itself, where if they just knew that one distinction, if they applied everything that is given on a metaphysical level that expresses the truth of the perfect oneness with God and Christ, if they took that literally and then saw the other things that don't express it that way as metaphor, then the Course never contradicts itself, and it makes perfect sense. So it's very important to remember that, or else you might believe that the Course is contradicting itself when it's really not. Another thing to remember is that you don't always have to forgive. I mean, if you're having a good time, and if you're with people who are expressing love, then there's no need to really practice forgiveness. Yes, at some point you have to realize that they're not bodies and that you're not a body, and you're bound to remember that. But the real problem areas are those things that we mentioned that activate some kind of a reaction in you, some kind of uncomfortableness, some kind of anger or upset. Those are the things that we really need to focus on. So when A Course in Miracles talks about how you don't judge anybody, or how you don't judge at all, it's not talking about the kind of judgment that you use when you decide, what color socks you're going to wear in the morning. It's not talking about giving up the kind of judgment that you use when you cross the street. Those are very practical forms of judgment, and we need those just to get by in the world, and it's not talking about that kind of judgment at all. When the Course says that you shouldn't judge a brother or a sister, what it's really saying is that you should not condemn them. In fact, there's a very famous workbook lesson in the Course in Miracles that says, love does not condemn. And so when we're being asked to give up judgment, what we're really being asked to give up in A Course in Miracles is the condemnation of other people, the negative thoughts that we have about them, which are really negative thoughts that we have about ourselves. And the only way that we'll ever get rid of those negative thoughts about ourselves, which are in the unconscious mind, which runs us, and that's what really runs us. People think that it's the beliefs that they have in their conscious mind that determines everything about them and what's going to happen. No, that's not it at all. What really determines everything is the beliefs that we have that we can't see, the ones that are in our unconscious mind. That's what runs us. And the only way to change them is to change the way that we look at other people and what's outside of us. And that's why that's the focus of A Course in Miracles. And if there's nothing to forgive, and if you're having a good time with somebody, then the Course says very specifically that you should celebrate. You should have a good time. So Jesus is somebody who had a good sense of humor, and he had a good time 2,000 years ago, and he partied, and he liked to laugh, and he liked to bring out the joy in others. And that's why I think it's really cool that you have a lot of drawings around nowadays where you see Jesus laughing and Jesus smiling, because that's much more in line with what he was really like than this suffering, brooding character that we've been given by organized religion. One thing that we don't have to do with the Course in Miracles is make it out to be important and real. Everything is an illusion, and that includes the Course. Even forgiveness is an illusion. But there is a difference. Let me read this quick quote from the Course. It says, "Forgiveness, then, is an illusion. But because of its purpose, which is the Holy Spirit's, it has one difference. Unlike all other illusions, it leads away from error and not towards it." So when we practice the kind of forgiveness that's taught in the Course, we're actually being led out of the illusion. And we need an illusion to lead us out of the illusion. Why? Because that's where we think we are. So we need something that meets us within the illusion in order to lead us out. One very important quality of that kind of forgiveness is to see people as being totally and completely innocent. You can't see people as being partially innocent, or else you'll just see yourself as being partially innocent. And there's no way around that. We have to forgive the world and everybody in it, and we can't hold any exceptions apart from that, or else it won't work. So here's another quote from the Course. It says, "Innocence is not a partial attribute. It is not real until it is total. The partly innocent are apt to be quite foolish at times. It is not until their innocence becomes a viewpoint with universal application that it becomes wisdom. Innocent or true perception means that you never misperceive and always see truly." Now, when my teachers quoted that quote from the Course to me in the Disappearance of the Universe, I said, "Are you saying I'm going to have to see everyone, no matter what, as being totally innocent?" And then Persis said, "That is correct. Once again, don't expect it to happen right away." And I said, "I don't know. How can a man like Hitler be innocent?" And Persis said, "That's a typical question. And the answer doesn't have anything to do with Hitler. As one who remembers my Jewish lifetimes very well, I'm not exactly a fan of the Nazis, skinheads, the KKK, or any of the other mentally injured groups. The reason they are innocent has nothing to do with the level of form. Hitler and everyone else in the world, including you, are equally innocent because what you are seeing is not true. This is your dream. As the Course teaches, the dream is not being dreamed by somebody else." So that brings up the subject of these terrible things that we see on the news all the time. You can't turn on the TV and watch the news without feeling bad sometimes, because what they do is they will pick the 20 worst things that happened in the world today. And it's a big world out there, and they will find the 20 absolute worst and most terrible things that happened in the world today, and they will tell you all about it. And it goes on all the time, and especially if they can find pictures of it, then that's what will headline the news. Because, if it doesn't have pictures nowadays, it's almost like it never happened. But if they can find footage of it, and if it's bad, then you can bet it's going to be right up at the top. Like they used to say, if it bleeds, it leads. And so, what if they balance that out, by the way? What if they showed you the 10 worst things that happened in the world today, and also showed you the 10 best things that happened in the world today? And balanced it out that way. Something, you wouldn't feel as bad at the end of that newscast, and it would be a much more balanced point of view, because that's duality. In the world, you have good and you have bad. But because the ego loves this stuff and wants us to feel bad and wants us to regard ourselves as bodies, which is the real secret of the ego, everything that we're set up for, it's like to make us think that we are bodies by making us think that the other ones are bodies. And so we watch the news and we feel terrible about the world, and nobody ever bothers to mention to you that people live longer today than they have ever lived, that they're healthier, that they're better off, better fed, actually have better lives today than they ever have. And that's completely escapes our attention. And, we think that all the things in this world are so terrible when they're really better than they've ever been. because we simply don't get told about it. Now, I'm not saying that we should, think that the world is a great place and that we should want to stick around here. All I'm saying is, how about a little bit of balance? So at least we can have at least duality restored, and we can see that there's both good and bad, and not just bad. So we see these terrible things happening, on the news. People are getting blown up. I was in London recently, and there had been bombs going off in London in what they call the Tube, but it's actually the subway in our language, but they call it the Tube, and there were also buses blown up and people were killed. And it's all really temptation to regard ourselves as bodies, because those poor people are blown up and we empathize with them as bodies, and we think that we're bodies. There's a section in the Course in Miracles called True Empathy. And under true empathy, what you do is you identify with them as Christ and see them as they really are. And then if they are Christ and they are not bodies, then that means that you are Christ and you are not a body. So once again, it always comes back to the way that you are seeing other people. And it's always related to bodies in some way. Like we see a terrible thing happen like the tsunami. And all these people are killed and washed away and their lives are ruined, and it's scary. And once again, if they're bodies and if they're victims, which it certainly appears to be on the level of form, then that's just temptation for us to think that we are bodies. And we see all these victims, and we empathize with the victims and feel bad for them, and we project our unconscious guilt onto the victimizers who are doing this to them, and we have the same result. We come to regard ourselves as bodies. There's a very interesting quotation from the Course that says, temptation, I was talking to Persa, the beautiful woman who appeared to me, and I told her I can resist anything except temptation. And Persa said to me, but what is temptation, really? And then she used that quote from A Course in Miracles, where the Course says, temptation has one lesson it would teach, in all its forms, wherever it appears. It would persuade the Holy Son of God he is a body, born in what must die, unable to escape its frailty, and bound by what it orders him to feel. So now we have the body's eyes looking out and seeing all this stuff, and it's an illusion, looking at an illusion, which we made up, and we made up the body so that the illusion would always seem real. And then it is telling us that we are bodies and tempting us to believe that we are bodies, which are separate. So the body is really just the thought of separation given form. And it's all a setup to convince us that this is what we are. And even the news that we watch at night, or whenever you watch it, it's set up to make us think that we are bodies. That's what it's all about. And it makes it real, and it makes victim and victimization real. So from that point of view, of course there are victims and victimizers, and they're all real, and they're all bodies, and somebody's bad and somebody's good. But once again, it's all a setup, and it's all there to convince us that we're really here and that we're really bodies. But there is a way out. And so you can apply it to the news just as easily as you can apply it to anything else, because it's just a picture in the mind. And if it's just a picture in the mind, you can forgive it. Another thing that I like to talk about is spiritual gifts, because some people think that, certain people have spiritual gifts, and maybe they feel bad because they don't think that they have any spiritual gifts, or they're not having the same spiritual gifts. I used to think that it would be really cool if I could be like a healer. If I could go around laying my hands on people and heal them. I used to think, wow, that would be really cool, and it would make me feel really good to be able to heal people. And that just isn't one of my gifts in this lifetime. If I try to heal somebody, I'm lucky if they don't die. So it's just not one of my gifts. But everybody has different gifts at different times. Maybe in a past lifetime of mine, I was a great healer. So none of us should feel bad, because everybody's going to have the same spiritual gifts eventually at different times, and they'll just show up at different times. It'd be kind of silly if we all had the same spiritual gifts at the same time. But let's redefine what a spiritual gift is. Let's say, for example, that you're an accountant, right? And you have this gift for adding up numbers and keeping everything straight, and you have a mind that is very good at organizing things like that, and you have a gift of being an accountant. Well, that can be a spiritual gift just as much as any other gift can be a spiritual gift. All you have to do is give that gift to the Holy Spirit. And if you give that gift to the Holy Spirit and say, I want to use this in your service, I want you to be in charge of how it's used and not me. And, that's a way of undoing the idea of separation, by putting the Holy Spirit in charge. And if you do that, then you may be guided as to a way that you can take that gift and use it. Not necessarily as a full-time job. It doesn't always have to be, your life's work. Let's say that you hear about a church that needs some help with accounting, or maybe some business that is in some way associated with the spiritual community, disseminating spiritual information of some kind. There may be something that you can do where you can take that gift under the guidance of the Holy Spirit and use it to help somebody. And that is just as much a spiritual gift as any other gift. It doesn't have to be the ability to heal people or the ability to read minds, or the ability to see the future. It doesn't have to necessarily be something that you would associate with being a spiritual gift. It could simply be something that you have a gift for, and it becomes a spiritual gift if you give it to the Holy Spirit and use it under His direction and in a way that you can be truly helpful to some kind of spiritual activity. And even then, it doesn't have to be a spiritual activity. That's just a suggestion. It could be anything that's good for people or helps people, anything that expresses love. That would certainly be a spiritual gift. So that's good to remember, because it doesn't always have to fit our pictures. What's important is that we do it with the Holy Spirit, give it to Him, and use it under His direction. It's good to remember that spiritual sight is an attitude. It shows up in the way that you show where you're coming from. It's not something that's seen with the body's eyes. Spiritual sight is not seen with the body's eyes. In fact, A Course in Miracles at one point says that the real world cannot be seen with the body's eyes. So the real world is invisible, and what we really are is invisible. And anything that can be seen with perception is not real. But spirit can show up symbolically in the world. And if it does, that's fine. If you have light episodes, if you see, lights or auras or ascended masters or angels or whatever, that's cool, but it's not necessary. It just shows up through certain parts of the mind, because there's really only one mind. Minds are actually joined. We'll talk about that more in a minute. And the reason that minds are joined is because there's really only one mind. And spiritual sight is in the way that you see other people. That's why it's called spiritual sight. And it has to do with your attitude of seeing everyone as being innocent. And you're ready to do that ahead of time. The word forgive, it has F-O-R at the beginning of it. It actually means to give ahead of time. So you're actually getting into a state of mind where you're ready to forgive anything, and it doesn't matter what it is. Just whatever happens, you're ready to forgive it. And then your forgiveness is becoming universal. And it's not what you do in the world, it's where you're coming from when you do it. So, you could have two people doing exactly the same thing, and one of them could be doing it with the ego, and the other one could be doing it with the Holy Spirit. I know environmental activists, and I know peace activists who hate people. They're out there protesting for peace, but it's not really about that. They hate their opponents. They hate their political opponents. They hate the people who are waging this terrible war. They hate the corporate pigs who supposedly benefit from it. These are the ideas that they have. And if you're coming from that kind of a state of mind when you're protesting against the war, then that is coming from an ego mindset where you're blaming the other side. You're projecting your unconscious guilt onto the other side. And all that will lead to is your personal belief that you are an ego and you are guilty. And yet, if you did the exact same thing, change nothing in the world, change nothing on the level of form about what you're doing, you could still go out there and protest against the war, but you could do it with the Holy Spirit, and it could be a totally different experience. Because now you could be coming from a place of love. And if you're coming from a place of love, it changes your experience. Now it's not about getting the other side, it's not about your political opponents or the people who you think are doing injustice in the world. Now it's simply about coming from a place of love. And when you do that, it changes the experience completely, and you can't go wrong. So that's the key. It's, where you're coming from, and are you doing it with the Holy Spirit, expressing a thought system of love. And so now you're protesting against the war simply because it's an expression of your love and how you would like the world to be, instead of this ego-ridden interpretation where it's about your political opponents, and getting them. Because if you only love some and not others, that's, special love. And it's not universal love. I'll give you an example of special love. There's this movie in the 1980s called Wall Street. and Michael Douglas played this character named Gecko, and he made a brilliant statement about special love. He was talking about these wasps in Connecticut who he hung around with. He called them white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And what he said about them was very interesting. He said, they love animals and hate people. And that's a very interesting statement about the ego, because that's an example of special love, where, the animals deserve to be loved, of course, because they're innocent. So we think that animals deserve to be loved. We think that little children, of course, deserve to be loved, and that they're innocent, and little babies are innocent. But then people grow up, and we find all kinds of reasons to project our unconscious guilt onto them. And any reason will do, because we literally have to get rid of that unconscious guilt. We have to make somebody else wrong. So you grow up and you're already divided from everybody. You're in a family, which means that your family is different than another family. So you're not in that family, you're in this family. And you have siblings, and you have, parents, and all these special relationships. But usually, if somebody you love does something wrong, it's easy to forgive them because, well, you love them. So it's easy to forgive them. But if it's somebody who you don't like and they do something wrong, you're never going to forgive those guilty bastards because they don't deserve it. And if somebody in your family killed somebody, you'd probably be right there in the courtroom rooting for them to get off. That's special love because, well, they're a part of your family, so of course you're with them. And the same thing, goes for when you fall in love with somebody. When they say love is blind, well, it is. But that's special love. And real love is not blind because it applies to everybody equally. And so you can't go wrong with it. Everybody is innocent. Everybody is worthy of your love. And if you're smart, you realize that by seeing them that way, that is also the way that you will eventually come to feel about yourself. I mentioned that minds are joined. Well, that's actually what makes all psychic phenomena possible. What it is like you have one mind, but because we have this thought of separation and duality and division and subdivision, then what happens is the mind divides kind of like cells under a microscope. You ever watch cells divide under a microscope? Well, that's what the mind does. In fact, a lot of things that we see in the world simply mimic what the mind does. A lot of the machines that we have mimic what the mind does. There's a lab at MIT that you can put your finger in and actually feel things that aren't there. That's kind of like the technology of the future. My teachers told me that someday we're going to have these movies that are so real you won't be able to tell the difference between what we think of as reality and the movie. It will be third-dimensional, holographic, and you'll be in the movie. And it will seem every bit as real as anything that we can see in what we call our life. Now, that may seem really cool, and I'm sure it is, and I like movies, and I like to be entertained, but I can see the temptation there for the future, because then people are going to want to create movies where they can have all the things that they can't have in their real life. And then that'll just keep them stuck there. That'll be another temptation to regard themselves as bodies and to stay stuck in the illusion forever. So, if you watch the ego closely, you can usually see its little tricks behind the scenes. We make things out to be very important and very beautiful and very spiritual in the world, but it's usually a trick. There's this section in A Course in Miracles called The Two Pictures, and what's in the picture, the ego wants to hide. So what the ego does is it makes up this really elaborate frame, and the frame is beautiful, and it's all these diamonds and rubies, and the purpose of the frame is to obscure the real picture, which is exactly what the universe of time and space has done. It's this amazing and large and beautiful, elaborate frame that we've made up to cover over the real picture. And the real picture is death and murder, because there's nothing in this world that can live without something else dying. It's literally impossible. And if you really look at nature, which we consider to be so beautiful, it's riddled with violence, even animals against other animals, trees against other trees. You go in the rainforest and you look underneath the surface, you would see trees actually trying to block other trees from getting the water so that they can have it for themselves. I mean, it's just amazing if you look more deeply. And the underlying nature of this world is death. That's why A Course in Miracles calls it the dream of death, because everything has to die and nothing can live without something else dying. So it's not a very pretty picture. So the ego has this elaborate frame to cover it over and stop us from really seeing what it is. And in A Course in Miracles, that frame is this big, elaborate, beautiful frame that the ego has made up, and it has all these diamonds and all these rubies, And then the Course says, if you look really close, you will see that the diamonds are really tears and the rubies are really drops of blood. And so that's how we've tried to dress up the world. At one point the Course says, can you paint ruby red lips on a skeleton and make it live? And that's the body. And it's not what we think it is, and it's not a very pretty picture. But the good news is, it's not real. It's not what we are. What we really are is beautiful. What we really are is perfect. It's love. And it's the most wonderful thing. And our job is simply to forgive that which is not us, so that we can get back in touch with our experience of what we really are. And that experience is the greatest experience in the world. So minds are joined, but then they appear to divide and subdivide like cells under a microscope. And then, you start off with 15 or 20 people in the world. Then before you know it, you have 6 billion people in the world. And the ego mind just keeps dividing and subdividing over and over and over again. And if the world were destroyed, and all 6 billion people in the world were wiped off the face of the earth, people might think that that would be the end. But it wouldn't be the end. It'd just be a new beginning, because the ego is still there in the mind. You could destroy every body in the world, it wouldn't make a bit of difference, because the ego would still have to manifest in some way. It would have to manifest the thought of separation. And maybe the ego would rather show up in different kinds of bodies. Maybe instead of showing up as dinosaurs, the ego wants this illusion of evolution to come into play, and so it shows up in more complicated ways in order to make us think that we are the most advanced beings that ever lived, so we can feel very special being human beings. When the truth is, it doesn't really matter, because it's all just illusion. And when you leave the body and go on in this illusion, then that isn't you anyway, and you have a brief experience of in-between time before you go into a different kind of a body. Another thing about the fact that there's just one mind, and that minds are joined, shows up in people's ability to see the future. They can tell what events are going to happen, or maybe they can read minds and join with other minds. And since minds are joined, that's why that's possible. Some people simply have more of an ability in that area than other people, but it's not really important. What's really important is, like any other gift, that you give it to the Holy Spirit and let Him be in charge. If you do that, you can't miss, because now you're being absolved of any responsibility, which absolves you of guilt. So that's the real reason why it's important to always put the Holy Spirit in charge. And you'll have other things like remote viewing, which is a very interesting phenomena. But once again, it's just a couple of barriers and walls being dropped in the mind and dissolved in the mind so that you can see someplace else. And there's not really anything strange or unusual about it. In fact, the Course in Miracles says that anybody who develops those kinds of abilities is simply becoming more natural, because the mind is not limited, and the mind cannot be limited. But we have limited ourselves by all these barriers and blocks that we put in the mind that prevent us from being aware of more. In fact, you could say that the whole phenomena of the experience of reincarnation is exactly that. That what we do is we wall things off in the mind. Because the truth is that we are everywhere and every time. It's like a quantum physicist will tell you that you are a non-local being having a local experience. So it's like you're everywhere. But then what we do is we kind of put up barriers in the mind to make it look like we're just here. And it's simply the thought of separation given form. So now we seem to have different bodies. And even though all of our past and future lives occurred at the same time, just as Einstein said, past, present, and future all occur simultaneously, it's like we wall things off in the mind. So now we are only aware of this little piece of time and space and this particular lifetime, when all of our other lifetimes are actually going on right now. They're not going on in the past. They're not going on in the future. There is no past or future. It's all a trick. It's all a thought of separation. And then we appear to live out a linear lifetime where one thing seems to happen after another, and we're stuck in this little speck of time and space, when the truth is we're really everywhere and every time. And even time is a separation idea. And I'm going to talk about the subject of time as we go along. But it's very interesting, the dynamics that the mind uses to make these things seem real when they're really not real. So there's no such thing as time. All of the lifetimes that we seem to have had happened all at once. And the Course teaches that it was all over with instantly, but we keep playing it out like we're replaying a videotape or something until we finally choose to go home. And that's an important decision. And it's a big decision because it involves the relinquishment of all personal identity now and forever. It's like giving up any thought of separation and individuality in favor of something better, but we don't know that it's better. We think that we're giving something up when we're really giving up nothing, and we're afraid of the unknown. And so we think that we're losing something when the truth is that, we're going to give up something that we have to give up anyway. I mean, we're going to die anyway. So what's the big deal about giving up a body that's going to be dead 30 years from now anyway? Why not get something wonderful? Why not get something glorious that's going to last forever in return, instead of just staying stuck in that same system ad nauseum? I mentioned the idea earlier, ideas leave not their source, to point out that what we seem to be seeing outside of ourselves is not really outside of ourselves, it's a trick, it's an optical illusion. I want to point out that there's some good news there with that idea that ideas leave not their source. And that is this: if ideas leave not their source, then we have never really left our source, which is God. We're still there. Now, Course in Miracles teaches, I am a thought in the mind of God. Well, if we're a thought in the mind of God, and if ideas leave not their source, then the truth is we have never left God. And we are still there right now, and it's out of our awareness. But by practicing forgiveness, we will actually have where we really are and what we really are return to our awareness. I'm going to read just a little paragraph here from A Course in Miracles because I think that it represents that idea very nicely and explains a lot in just a few sentences. The idea is a workbook lesson. I walk with God in perfect holiness. And this is what it says. Today's idea but states the simple truth that makes the thought of sin impossible. It promises there is no cause for guilt, and being causeless, it does not exist. It follows surely from the basic thought so often mentioned in the text: ideas leave not their source. If this be true, how can you be apart from God? How could you walk the world alone and separate from your source? So that is why we walk with God in perfect holiness. If we're still with Him, then how can we be guilty? If we're still there with Him, how can we be apart from Him? How can we be sinful? It wouldn't be possible if we're still there. It wouldn't be possible if we're not bodies. It wouldn't be possible if we are spirit. So, if we remember where we really are, then we don't have to feel guilty when we see all these other things that appear to be happening, and because they're not really happening. And it really is amazing what is possible when you start to break down some of these barriers that are in the mind. I'll remind you of that quote from the Course that says, "This Course does not aim at teaching the meaning of love, for that is beyond what can be taught. It does aim, however, at removing the blocks to the awareness of love's presence." Well, something interesting happens when you start to remove those blocks. You're actually breaking down barriers in the mind, and you're getting more in touch with the power of the mind. And some very interesting things might happen, and you may find that you can do some pretty amazing things as long as you remember that they're not real and don't get hung up on them. Like, I remember that once I was sitting there and Arden and Purser appeared to me, and Arden said, "Are you ready?" And I said, "Ready for what?" And then what they did was instantaneously they transported me to a city that was 30 miles away from where I live. I was instantly transported from Poland Spring, Maine to Portland, Maine, which is on the seacoast. It was a hot summer day. All of a sudden I was sitting on this cement step in front of a building on a street that I recognized because I had been to Portland a few times and walked there. And it was instantaneous. It was a complete 360-degree change. And it wasn't that the trip was such a mind-blower. It was the fact that I was someplace totally different than I was just a split second before. That was the mind-blower. That's why it's the wildest ride I ever had, because it was just totally astonishing to me. And they had me get up and walk with them. Arden and Purser were walking down the street in Portland, Maine, and they were pointing out things to me, like the place that Mary Baker Eddy went when she first went to Portland, Maine, and was healed by Quimby, and his name was Phineas Quimby, a great healer at that time. And the whole point that they wanted to make was that everything that we were seeing is a projection that is coming from the mind. And so if it's a projection, then if you got in complete touch with the power of the mind, then you could change to a different part of it. You could change to another place or another time or another space, and it really wouldn't matter what it was. If you were in total touch with the power of the mind, you could do anything like that. So when Jesus talked about moving mountains and things like that, he wasn't talking about doing it physically. He was saying that literally nothing is impossible when you get in touch with the power of the mind. Indeed, anything is possible, because you're simply becoming more natural as you break down those barriers that exist within the mind. It's helpful to remember that everything that we see in the world is there to tempt us into reacting and into judging. I think that politics is one of the most obvious things, and it's not very subtle, and yet we fall for it anyway because we think that the world is real and we think that there really are victims and victimizers. So most of us who get involved in politics in any way, even if you just vote, and half of us don't vote anyway, but the ones who do are the ones who care, are bound to get kind of like caught up in this sometimes. I've seen spiritual teachers turn to politics, make a big deal out of politics. You would think that they were almost like politicians rather than spiritual teachers, because it always becomes about fixing up the world or changing something in the world. But that's not what true spirituality is about. True spirituality is about forgiving the world, and then you can see it differently. And then sure, if you feel guided to do something in the world, then you will, but that's not the point. Because what you're going to do in the world isn't going to work anyway. That's practically guaranteed. The best that you can do in this world is have some kind of a temporary impact. So what it's really about is doing it as an expression of who you are. As we were talking about earlier, it's about where you're coming from. So, we see these politicians out there that we're going to disagree with and that we're not going to like. And I think we all know that politicians have issues. And it's like we're going to get caught up in saying, whatever you want to call them. But what that really is an opportunity for us to be free. And we are the ones who will benefit if we forgive them. It's not like they're really there. Yes, it looks like they're really there. But you can have a dream in your bed at night where things seem totally real. And you can even be aware of the fact that you're dreaming. Like they call it lucid dreaming. You actually are aware of the fact that you are dreaming. And the first thing that people do, if they start lucid dreaming, the very first thing that they want to do is control the dream and make the dream a different dream and have it come out a certain way. And so once again, you get stuck right into the effect instead of being at cause. There are people who try to practice lucid dreaming because they think that after the body dies, that if they can control the dream while they're lucid dreaming and make decisions in the dream and be aware of it, then they will also be able to make those same kind of decisions after they leave the body, and maybe even choose to not reincarnate and not come back again. The only problem with that is that it doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because, as we said earlier, as long as there's any unconscious guilt that's there in the mind, you will come back and you will reincarnate. And it doesn't matter how much you practice lucid dreaming or anything else, because what really causes us to reincarnate is that unconscious guilt in the mind. So you could decide, I'm going to make a decision to not come back. But if that unconscious guilt starts to catch up with you in the mind, then you will make a decision to come back as a way of hiding from it. So things like lucid dreaming are really interesting, and maybe they can help us achieve even better decision-making abilities while we appear to be here in the world. It just won't work when it comes to ending reincarnation. But it does definitely serve as an example that dreams can seem very real. And that includes this dream that we seem to be living right now. And we could use lucid dreaming to get in touch with the fact that it's us that's doing it and that we have the power to change our mind about it. It may be helpful to remember that usually the politician that's going to win the election is the one who gets the people to feel the most fearful, the one who appeals to the ego, the one who appeals to fear in people. If you can project unconscious guilt onto your opponent, if you can get the people to agree that that guy is the problem and not you, it's his fault. He's the guilty party. He's the one who doesn't deserve it. If you can do that, that's the politician that wins the election. It works every time. We see it over and over and over again. This is true with lawyers in their trials. If you have a jury trial, what one lawyer is trying to do is get the jury to project their unconscious guilt onto the other side. If you can get them thinking that the other side is the bad person, the other side is the guilty party, they're the cause of the problem, then you're going to win the trial. So that's why I said earlier, that's what makes the world go wrong. If you want to get something done in this world, if you want to get people to do a certain thing, then you either make them feel guilty or you make them project their unconscious guilt onto somebody else, and it works very nicely. And that may help your entertainment value when it comes to watching some of these things on TV, including the elections and including the trials that go on. Probably the best representation of the world is if you watch soap operas. I personally don't watch soap operas very much, but once in a while I can't help but be thumbing through the TV and channel hopping, and all of a sudden these soap operas will come on. A prerequisite of soap operas is that nobody can ever be happy. And if they do achieve some kind of temporary and fleeting happiness, then that happiness must be destroyed by a terrible tragedy, and so that the people can be miserable for the rest of their lives. And the ego loves this stuff because that's what the ego wants in order to tempt us into thinking that we are bodies. So it's always somebody else who did us wrong, somebody else who is spoiling our happiness. But the truth is that there's only one thing in the world that can stop us from being happy. There's only one thing in the world that can stop us from being peaceful, and that is our own decision. By seeing the world as real and all the things that seem to be happening in it as real, then eventually we're going to be led to misery, because the world always falls apart and everything in it always goes down the tubes eventually, and nothing can ever really last. But if we go back to the cause, which is in the mind, and forgive the world, then we can be happy and peaceful regardless of what appears to be happening in the world. And then it doesn't matter what seems to happen. We can be happy anyway. And then when the good stuff happens, heck, it can even be more fun than it would have been. So I think that soap operas are a very good representation of what the ego wants. And if you watch them, then it gets kind of funny, but then when you go look at the rest of the world, that gets kind of funny too, because you see these same kinds of patterns at play no matter where you look. When we turn to the international situation, then we see, just like people project their unconscious guilt onto other people, countries project their unconscious guilt onto other countries. So just like people are brought up in different families and have a different background, so they think a little bit differently than other people, which is another ego setup, because the ego wants people to be different so that they won't agree with each other and they won't see eye to eye. The ego wants us to see things from a different point of view. That's why we also have different cultures and different countries, so that we will grow up thinking differently than each other, have a different background, have different beliefs, and then when the other country does something even remotely bad, then we will have the worst possible interpretation of them that we can possibly come up with. So now they're doing wrong, and we have a right not just to project our unconscious guilt onto them, because most people don't even know that they're doing that. They just think they're right. And obviously the other country is wrong, and they deserve to be punished. And so we see the same dynamic at work in international relationships as we see in personal relationships. It just shows up on more of a macro level. And it's all made up. Even the idea of countries is made up. If you look from the space shuttle to the Earth, you don't see any lines in the land. You don't see any borders. There's this great organization called Doctors Without Borders, and they just help people the best that they can, and it doesn't matter where they are, and it doesn't matter what the politics are, because, this whole idea of countries is just made up. It's like John Lennon said in the song Imagine, imagine if there's no countries. Well, maybe someday, because what is a country except a border? And what is a border except the thought of separation, dividing one from another? So even the idea of countries and the idea of borders is simply another ego device that represents separation. And what we need to do is forgive people, and by joining with them at the level of the mind, we can undo all of that, so that things can eventually get less and less divided. We see it going on in Europe with the formation of the European Union. We see countries kind of like taking on less importance, even though there's certainly a lot of resistance to that. But we see countries taking on less importance and people kind of like fusing together and joining together. And I think that's a very healthy development, because it's representative of joining instead of separation and instead of division. and perhaps we'll see more and more of that in the world as we go along. But at the same time, we should keep our focus where it belongs, which is on the level of the mind, which forgives everything. And if we do that, then we ourselves can be released from all of it.